Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you are watching this webinar. Again, my name is Dave Nagel, very excited to share with my colleagues from Valley View School District and this webinar, which is Creating Effective Scoring Guides Part 1. This is an overview of some of the elements to create an effective scoring guide. I'll come back in a subsequent webinar, Part 2, where we will look even deeper at how we connect the scoring guides to the effective writing of success criteria and learning intentions. But for now, just an overview of creating effective scoring guides. Again, by this point in time, I'm guessing most of you have either been in person with me, as I've had a pleasure in the last couple of years of working with a lot of folks in Valley View, but maybe you've been a part of a couple of the cohorts, or you've seen one or two of the webinars, I would imagine. But a little bit about my background, but most importantly, as a former classroom teacher and then building level administrator at the district level, supporting CFA implementation. And then as a professional developer, really since about 2003, I've had the privilege of working with clients all over the country and even internationally in a few cases with Larry's work, whether it was some of the core elements of CFA 2.0 of prioritization or unwrapping, or just the whole process of CFA 2.0 and developing quality effective assessment. So jumping right in, you've heard me mention this before time and time again, and I will every time we come together, there's a short webinar like this, but any assessment, if we apply these 3 points, what's our purpose? And then when do we gather enough evidence to make an effective or quality inference about student understanding so we know what to do differently in our scoring guides? The manner in which we write them can really impact the quality of the inferences we make and the evidence we gather from students by being as effective and clear and concise. I'm going to walk us through some quick examples here on this first webinar on scoring guides. You kind of see where scoring guides fall in Larry's 10-step design process. And for those of you that have been in the cohorts, you realize that while all of these pieces do fit together as a nice, effective puzzle, so to speak, all of these practices really are bread and butter, just quality instructional assessment actions that teachers should take. We're going to talk a little bit about how creating the initial scoring guide after we've created the post-assessment, at least as a first draft, and then aligning it later to the success criteria can really help that assessment develop over time and become something that really empowers the students to know what's expected, but also empowers the teacher to make some quality inferences from the evidence that they gather from student work. So moving along, sorry about that, but why scoring guides? Why do we use them? And again, Larry uses the term scoring guide, and we're going to talk in a moment. Some of you might use the term rubric, but because we want to avoid this. And far too often, we've been there as former students, and maybe we've even been there as teachers, not knowing what our administrators are expecting of us. And that's where our Danielson rubric should come into play. But we want students to not be guessing as to what's expected. We want them to be as concise in terms of their understanding of what we're asking them to produce to us in a constructed response item, which would require a scoring guide. So that way, they're not trying to write what they think we're looking for, as opposed to how the directions and the guidance within the scoring guide can empower them to know what is needed. And students must know what is expected for them to reach, but also demonstrate mastery. What do I need to demonstrate in terms of my learning? And that should be very clear within directions and scoring guides, as Larry refers to them, we're going to talk a lot about, which really drives the 3 questions we consistently want to ask to develop assessment-capable learners. Where am I going? How am I going? And then where to next? That where to next can really come to life in the quality of the scoring guide that I'm going to walk us through, that empowers both the teacher and the students themselves to provide them with feedback. The teacher can provide feedback from the scoring guide if it's of quality, and the students can use it as a guide, not for scoring for points or the grade, but to score themselves in terms of where they're at in reaching the success criteria or mastery of the expectations of the standards. So simple definition here, the scoring guide, and they refer to rubrics, and sometimes you might see slightly different definitions where the rubric digs into quality. We're going to use these terms synonymously and intentionally with that word guide, because they're the detailed success criteria that make the performance expectations explicit of what I ask the students to be able to do based on the standard, based on the unwrapping, and then based on the constructed response items that I create on my common formative assessment. We're not going to need a scoring guide for a selected response item. We're going to need it when it's a constructed response to guide the student And because by default, there's going to probably be at times more than one right answer or multiple ways that students can demonstrate elements of mastery of the standard. So again, it shows exactly what students need to include in their response, nothing more, nothing less. We're going to talk about a simple term called hand to glove. What we see in the directions, we should also see in the scoring guide. So now jumping in again, how we construct effective scoring guides. And here's some questions to consider, and this might be a good time to pause the recording if you're in a group. But how to define proficiency or mastery or achieves based on the student work or their performance demonstration? What is the criteria we're going to use? It should go back then to the standard that we've unwrapped. The number of proficiency or mastery levels, and sometimes there's 4, sometimes there's an exceeds level, sometimes it's very simple and it's achieves, close, or far away. And so thinking about how many levels and not to just concoct an exceeds category at times. How we name those levels, and we're going to push a little bit away from the term proficiency and into achieves the success criteria for several reasons. It ensures we've got a more common shared language of learning. And really, this goes back to what the success criteria really was for that particular item, which doesn't by default mean that it's automatically guaranteed proficiency in the standard. Maybe it's only addressing part of the standard. The difference between a holistic or an analytic scoring guide. I'm going to guide us through an example of that in just a moment. Any scoring guide should have a blend of qualitative, of elements that go above and beyond the standard that are a little bit more subjective, and the quantitative, which is much more measurable, or what we might call a closed skill. And then is it a task specific or generic? And I'm going to highlight through a couple of the examples through this webinar. And again, for those of you that haven't been through the cohorts, it's just a great overview as we come into the session. And if you have been through before, it's a great review, but it's nothing that I've designed any specific work to go with it. Some of the webinars have a supporting handout. One of the points I want to make is the difference between an analytic and a holistic scoring guide. We're probably going to err on the side of using more analytical scoring guides where each criteria is evaluated separately. We can be a better diagnoser of the elements within the criteria of what students are missing or not and provide formative feedback. You'll see that in the examples here that I'm going to provide momentarily. And we can better link that to the instruction, where if it's just 4, 3, 2, 1, you either get it or you don't, there's a chance that we could miss some instructional pieces and make those differentiated needs at times and more adaptable to students' learning needs. So we can focus on the criteria that they've met and where we need to go next and help guide their own learning. It does take a little bit more time to score when there's multiple aspects within each category. Holistic, all the criteria is evaluated at one time. The writing as a whole, or the elements within the computation and math, or things of that nature, and it's usually more effective for a summative assessment, and there's less opportunity to provide formative feedback. We're really going to err on the side of analytic, but I at least wanted to highlight these 2 points because at times we've sort of used these interchangeably, and we're really going to push more for that analytical for specific score and different level of criteria, not score for the points or for the grade by default, but the different elements that are within the scoring guide. I'm going to highlight that in a moment. One of the big takeaways I'd like everybody to have from this webinar is to avoid as much as possible subjective language, sort of those murky expectations and the subjective adjectives that we put into our scoring guides, descriptors that are vague or general, that not only can students not interpret them effectively, teachers across classrooms teaching the same subject matter wouldn't be able to differentiate them when we have general and vague terms. I'm going to highlight some of those in a moment. So above all else, this is the most important takeaway, to avoid as much of the subjective language as possible. And I use the metaphor of a toothpaste tube. You can never get all of the toothpaste out of it, but you want to get as much as you can. There'll always be some subjectivity, but we want to squeeze as much out as possible. And here's some examples of a 4-level rubric that was permeating with subjectivity. And this is literally one from an example that I've pulled from some of the work that I've done with districts at times, but internalized understanding, clearly, originality, demonstrates adequate understanding or general understanding. We would have to measure that. We would have to have some specific examples of what these terms are: limited, partial, demonstrates, I actually apologize, I went a little fast there, limited understanding, partial understanding of the concepts, demonstrates little to no understanding. Again, these really don't empower not only the student to know what to do, but really realistically, this would be very difficult to have any degree of reliability in collaborative scoring from one classroom to another if teachers were looking at student work at the same time. A struggle that teachers have, though, when we talk about creating effective scoring guides and using them is the time needed, because we're going to have to score them, and our desire to best support students. And so I want to kind of guide us in ways in this little example, and then more importantly, when you come for the cohorts, if those of you that haven't, how to put this into practice, not only in the common formative assessments you'll develop, but in maybe some existing scoring guides, or if you've referred to them as rubrics before, that you're using. How to save you time and empower both yourself and the student as to what the expectations are. And so we'll use the term hand to glove. What we mean by that is what we write on the directions for the students, we should clearly have it in the scoring guide. If it's not in the directions, it shouldn't be in the scoring guide. And if it's not in the scoring guide, don't need to have it in the directions, or vice versa. So we're going to walk through just a couple of very quick examples. The chart below here for a math example. Fill in the missing values, explain how you've determined them. So let's take a look at the criteria. Correctly includes the missing values, explains the relationships between the number, and explains how the values were added to the table. This is what we would call an analytical scoring guide, because we might check 2 of the 3 boxes and not the third one because they include the values, but they didn't explain properly. Or maybe they explained correctly and they explained the relationship, but their computation was off. So what we see in the directions, we should see in the scoring guide and see how quickly we can provide immediate feedback and actually guide the student to where they could be missing something, and they could begin to guide their own learning and evaluate their own work long before they ever hand it in. Walk us through one simple English language arts extended response, constructive response item. So using the information from 2 passages that we read in class, write a 3 to 5 paragraph argument that explains whether or not you agree that Rosa Parks should be considered the mother of the civil rights movement. So that was what the students were given. Let's take a look for that hand-to-glove fit. State your point of view clearly in the opening thesis. Organize your ideas logically. Use at least 4 unit vocabulary terms effectively. Include a tight concluding statement to summarize your argument in your final paragraph. Quickly, you can see the connection between the scoring guide and your response include and what's ahead in the extended response which the students were given. I want to show you this exact same item that another teacher used to create the criteria, and you see almost the exact same piece here. State your point of view, clear introduction, organize logically, include unit vocabulary. That's the directions the students were given. The achieves the success criteria, which you see below, states the point of view, includes 2 pieces of evidence, 1 from each passage. And if you remember, I talked earlier about at times there could be a generic element. For any writing, it should have a clear introduction, a body, a concluding statement, 3 to 5 unit vocabulary terms. That could be used every time we ask the students to write. Anything less than these 3 points, and actually with point 3, there's 4 points under that, is simply not achieving the success criteria. First, though, let's talk about what does exceeds mean. And I'm really not quite sure what those extra simple bullet points were on that slide. I'm going to try and get rid of that quickly. Sometimes when I do a cut and paste, it makes different kinds of bullets show up. So apologize for that. Got it fixed there. One point about the exceeds. So sometimes certain items won't have an achieves, and there's no reason to go above and beyond, to not concoct it. But when we want to have an exceeds criteria, we want to make sure we have some qualitative measures. So to go above and beyond from the first scoring guide that I showed you a second ago, this one states a point of view, includes 2 pieces of evidence, organizes the writing to include those points. Above and beyond would mean all of the achieves have been met, plus any of these following. They connect specific textual evidence to support their argument from both texts, demonstrating from different points of view from each author, because they were reading 2 different texts, 2 different authors. They're connecting that. We can provide students with some self-regulation feedback. Opening statement has a sharp, tight hook for the reader. Remember, we talk about the 3 levels of feedback: task, process, and self-regulation. Here's a place to provide students self-regulation feedback with one of these points. Maybe it's to go back and have a better opening statement. Support your argument with more clear rationale and be even more specific with your text-based citations. Maybe provide additional information from another credible source related to Mrs. Park's life. So again, the exceeds should be above and beyond after you've met the achieves. And notice the qualitative measure here. It wasn't just use more vocabulary. It wasn't just cite more evidence. There's a qualitative measure. Excuse me, what a great place to provide that self-regulation feedback. We see here then, it's an important point. Anything less than achieving is developing or beginning. And instead of trying to write out a description of what the criteria is for developing or beginning, I see it a lot in some of the scoring guides or rubrics come home with my son's work. He's a sixth grader, and there'll be a description, a paragraph, 2 or 3 paragraphs to be exact, on how to make your work almost right but not right, an actually clear description of how to make your work a train wreck. Let's walk through one more example. Here's another extended response item. The Roman Empire was a power civilization, but it collapsed. Identify and explain 3 to 4 internal and external forces that contributed to the empire's decline and analyze how those forces have impacted each other. Make sure your writing meets the requirements stated on the scoring guide. Let's take a look at this simple, concise scoring guide. First thing we're looking at is the achieves criteria. Demonstrates all of these. Identified, no less than 3, but no more than 4 internal and external forces, and then analyzes how those forces impact each other. And then your writing, as always, must include a clear topic, organized ideas, relevant details, precise vocabulary, concluding statement. Above and beyond, we want the student to hit all of the achieves, but then could you make a comparison between the fall of the Roman Empire and a collapse of another civilization, maybe one that we've studied? But I really want us to look at how empowering and how much less cumbersome this scoring guide is for what is below achieves. We have not just a checklist, but places to provide students feedback when they've met it and where their next step would be, as opposed to saying, identified 3 internal forces but didn't really explain them. Didn't quite analyze those forces, how they impacted, or analyzed incorrectly how they impacted each other. Instead of that, we have demonstrates 5 of the achieves, demonstrates fewer of the 5, quicker to provide feedback, both from the teacher to the student, but also from the student to themselves, and if there's any peer editing that would go on. So while I'm demonstrating this as a piece that you'll use when you design your assessment, this can be used with any type of scoring guide we use, and we can even take some of our existing ones and simply clean up what comes after achieves, after meets, after proficient, whatever our term is. And now we've got a concise document that's simple to understand and doesn't confuse and mystify the scoring and grading process eventually. Because eventually we will be grading these to some degree. This can demystify that process. And I just wanted to highlight a quick writing rubric that I pulled for this webinar. But we see exemplary, target, acceptable, unacceptable, and some of these certainly writing contains multiple errors. But take a look at the target. While there may be minor errors, the writing follows normal conventions, spelling and grammar. That would be a great place to have a quantitative measure, less than 3 spelling errors. Most ideas are unsupported. Presents ideas in general terms. Very confusing both for myself as I'm looking at that. What is presents ideas in general terms as opposed to with effective examples? How we can take what they have here as the target, make those even tighter, and then not have an overly cumbersome wordy document like this, where we have words like adequate. We have words like unsupported. We have not necessarily connected. We just have a lot of terms that would be extremely vague that we can clean up much more efficiently. And for example, if we look under language, errors cause noticeable distraction. That's very subjective based on the author or the person who's scoring or grading them. What might be noticeable distraction for somebody isn't noticeable for me, and now all of a sudden we have a student who is getting a target or even an exemplary score in one classroom, but if they would have been across the hallway, it might have been different. So this is also something when we talk about developing our scoring guides collaboratively. It's a great activity in our PLCs and our collaborative settings now with existing scoring guides to minimize some of the confusion that can take place. I hope this was a general overview that empowered some of you, if you haven't been to the session, to have an idea of what the scoring guide session will entail and whether you have been through the cohort or not. It's another chance to hopefully consider how we can very easily clean up some of the lack of a shared language of learning or increase the shared language of learning with more effective and quality scoring guides that are clear and concise. We describe the students clearly in the achieves category, what we ask them to do in the directions, and then anything less than that, we simply say you haven't met that, but maybe you've met 4 of those or 3 of those or some number. If you have any questions anytime, please shoot me an email at davenagelvlplus@gmail.com. See my Twitter handle and the corwin.com website and my grading website, gradingforimpact.com. Thank you so much for your attendance here. I look forward to seeing everybody in Valley View very, very soon.